After years studying abroad, brother returns home, and dad tells daughter he gets the room, go sleep in the garage with the dog. Brenda had always been the kind of person who seemed made of silence. A silence that wasn't empty but full. Full of gestures no one saw, presences no one recognized, feelings she kept with an almost invisible delicacy. From a very young age, she carried the weight of being forgotten with a lightness that seemed impossible, like someone who had learned to exist along the edges. She grew up in a house where words echoed but didn't reach, where sound wasn't absence, but recognition. The death of her mother, still in childhood, opened a hole that never closed, and Robert, her father, tried to fill it his way, with control, rigid rules, and a form of love that weighed differently on each child. Brenda, from the beginning, knew that her place was not the center. While she learned to cook with care, to clean every corner of the house perfectly, to study diligently and quietly, she saw her father's eyes light up only for Scott. Her brother was the son expected, the pride Robert nurtured like a trophy. He was the one who received the biggest smiles, the compliments without reason, the hope that her father hung on his shoulders like a medal of merit already earned. Brenda didn't hate Scott for this. She didn't know how to hate. She had too big of a heart to hold grudges, even when it hurt. And it always hurt. It hurt in silence, with depth, with consistency. Still, she loved her father. A love without demands, without expectations, without asking for space or return. A love that hurt and was loyal. She grew up as the shadow beside the brother who shone like the sun, and never complained. Never asked for anything. She just followed, doing what needed to be done, while learning to exist without being noticed. But life didn't stop, not even for those who learned to fade away. Time moved forward while Brenda stayed in that discreet role. While she occupied herself with keeping the house alive, taking care of everything with silence and routine, Scott grew under a light that never went out. Since childhood, he had all the doors opened before he even had to push them. Robert's eyes always followed him closely, like someone watching a promising show. Every word Scott said was listened to with interest, every mistake was forgiven easily, and every success was celebrated like a collective achievement. It was as if her father had placed all the promises he himself hadn't fulfilled in his youth into Scott. "You'll go far, my son," Robert would often say while patting the boy on the shoulder. "This country is too small for you." Brenda, in the background, listened. It wasn't anger she felt. It was an old weariness, as if her emotions had already passed their expiration date. She kept cleaning the dishes, folding clothes, taking care of the bills, without expecting applause. Scott grew up under this constant expectation. He had lessons in anything he asked for, free time to study, friends who admired his talents, and above all, a father to open paths. When Robert heard of a study program in Europe, he decided that would be his son's destination. He saved money, sold tools, and asked for favors. "He needs this, Brenda," Robert said one night, sitting at the table, his eyes glued to the newspaper. "You understand, right?" She simply nodded, as she always did. She didn't ask if there would be money for her to study too, or if she could even try something similar. "Of course, Dad," she replied, while gathering the dinner dishes. The day Scott left was almost a ceremony. Robert took him to the airport, his eyes teary and his voice full of pride. Brenda stayed, as always. She stayed taking care of the house, the bills, the food, and her father. Years passed. Scott sent photos of distant cities, places full of light, rooms with books in another language. He called when he remembered, wrote little, but always with the air of someone who had much to say, and little time to listen. When he announced he would be back for a visit, Robert entered a state of euphoria Brenda hadn't seen since she was a child. He painted the house, bought new towels, ordered his son's favorite dish to be made. "Your brother is coming tomorrow," he exclaimed, almost stumbling with excitement. Brenda smiled gently. "Do you want me to make the passion fruit dessert he liked?" she asked. "Yes, yes, but make it well. He'll be tired from the trip," Robert replied, excited. When Scott arrived, it was as if a king had returned to the castle. The different accent, the expensive clothes, the way he no longer seemed to belong to that house, all of him seemed untouchable. Robert cried when he saw him. My son, he said, hugging him tightly. "Look at you." Scott laughed, adjusting the watch on his wrist. "Yeah, a lot has changed, Dad." "Go to your room. It's all ready for you," Robert said, beaming at Scott as if he were handing him a prize. Brenda, standing by the door, felt her body stiffen. She didn't understand right away. She blinked slowly, as if she had heard wrong. Her eyes turned to her father with caution, and her voice came out softer than she would have liked. "That room is mine, Dad," she said, almost whispering. Robert didn't even turn his face. He kept looking at Scott, enchanted by his son's presence. He waved his hand as if dismissing an irrelevant detail. "Oh, daughter, the other room was torn down a few years ago, remember? That ceiling leak. There's nowhere for him to stay now. You can sleep in the garage for now. Just for a few days." Brenda remained motionless. She tried to understand if it was a poorly made joke. But there was no irony in her father's voice. He spoke as if it were the only logical solution, as if she hadn't slept there for years, as if that room had never been hers. "In the garage," she repeated, not changing her tone, just to confirm that she had heard the absurdity. Yes, yes. Bring some blankets. There's a folded mattress in the laundry room cupboard. And the dog will keep you company. It's just until Scott leaves. After that, you'll return." He said this so naturally, as if he were asking her to change the living room rug, as if she were a piece of furniture that could be moved around with no problem, no weight, no feeling. Brenda didn't argue. There was no room for argument. She just nodded with a slight movement of her head, as if accepting what had already been decided before being said. There was no anger in his voice, just the same certainty that had always guided his decisions. Scott first. Always. She just took a few things, went downstairs and crossed the yard to the garage. The dog wagged its tail when it saw her. She sat beside it, ran her hand through the dog's fur, and smiled with sadness. "Let's share this space, okay?" she whispered. She settled in a corner with 2 blankets and a pillow she took from the living room. The floor was cold, but she was used to this kind of discomfort. She didn't cry. She never cried. She lay on her side, eyes open, listening to the sound of the wind outside, smelling the dog's scent and tasting the loneliness she knew so well. Scott stayed for a few days. He woke up late, went out to see old friends, talked little. At night, he laughed with his father in the living room, while Brenda gathered the dishes without being invited to the conversation. "You should come more often, son," Robert said one night. "This house is different when you're here." Scott laughed. "We'll see. The schedule's tight, Dad." "But just seeing you makes me feel younger," Robert replied. Brenda passed by them with a tray in her hands. They didn't say anything. Neither did she. When Scott announced his departure, Robert almost begged him to stay longer. "I can't, Dad. Life's waiting for me there," Scott said as he packed his suitcase. Of course. I understand," Robert replied, trying to smile. The next day, the car that took Scott disappeared down the road. Robert stayed there, standing at the gate, his gaze fixed on the emptiness, as if believing that if he waited long enough, his son would turn back. Brenda watched from afar, from the kitchen, her hands still wet from the dishes. She knew this scene wasn't new. The father watching his son leave with his chest full of longing, and she staying, invisible as always. At night, the house filled with a silence that wasn't the absence of sound, but the return of an old companion. It was the same silence from all the years, thick, without affection, without conversation. Brenda entered slowly through the back door, passed by the living room, where her father stared at the television without paying attention, and went to the kitchen. She gathered the remnants of dinner, washed the dishes with automatic movements, dried her hands, and returned to the garage. Scott had left, but no one invited her back to the room. No words, no gestures. The room was now an empty altar, untouched, as if the sun could return at any moment. Robert didn't even mention it. Brenda didn't either. Staying in the garage seemed easier than opening space for yet another rejection. Sleeping next to the dog was more comfortable than competing with her father's silence. She lay on the folded mattress, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and stared at the low ceiling. Everything was in the same place, the cold, the smell of dust, the emptiness. But inside, something was beginning to change. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was something else. A kind of restlessness. A new, silent desire she still couldn't name. The days followed the same cadence. She woke up before the sun, made the coffee her father drank without thanking, cleaned the house that no one complimented, lived in a presence that seemed weightless. Robert returned to the old habit of not saying much. Scott didn't call, didn't write, didn't send any news. None of this surprised her. It was just the continuation of what had always been. But inside Brenda, something moved, like a sliver of light trying to pass through a locked door. One afternoon, after scrubbing the floor in the living room that no longer seemed dirty, she felt it. The house was too heavy. The routine, the silence, the impeccable floor. Everything suddenly seemed unnecessary. She grabbed her purse, put a book inside almost without thinking, and left. She needed to leave. She needed to see something not stained by the past. She wandered the streets without a clear destination until she stopped in front of the small neighborhood library. It was a place she knew but rarely visited. Still, on that day, it seemed to call her. She entered without saying anything to anyone. Inside, the air was fresh, smelling of old paper and calm. Among the shelves, she found a man with his eyes immersed in a book, unaware of everything around him. He had short hair and a serene expression, a type of serenity she hadn't seen in a long time. Brenda picked a random book just to have something in her hands and moved to the next shelf. He glanced at her and smiled gently. "This one's good," he said, pointing to the cover in her hands. "Is it?" she replied, surprised to be noticed. "Yes, but the ending is sad," he said, carefully closing his own book. "But true." She let out a sincere smile. "Sometimes, sad and true is all we need." He chuckled softly, as if he understood more than he said. "My name's Daniel," he said, extending his hand naturally. "Brenda," she replied, touching his hand for the first time. And there, among silent books and simple words, something was born, small, calm, and unexpected. Something she had never really had, the feeling of being seen. Meeting Daniel was like opening a window in a house closed for years. There was no explosion, no dazzling, no exaggerated enchantment that one reads about in romances. It was another kind of meeting, a calm, almost shy meeting, but with the weight of truth. Brenda felt it grow slowly, like things that come to stay. They began to see each other there, among shelves and pages read in silence, sharing shy coffees when leaving the library and aimless walks through the neighborhood street. Daniel didn't talk much, and that was exactly what touched her. He listened. He listened with his whole body, with a rare patience, like someone who had time, or more importantly, desire. "Do you always come here?" he asked one afternoon while they flipped through books at a corner table. "No. I only came that day because... I don't know, I felt I needed to leave the house," she replied without looking up from the book. "Maybe that's why you came, to meet me," Daniel said without irony, without forced charm, just with a lightness that disarmed her. Brenda smiled. She didn't answer, but inside she felt a small anchor loosen. Over time, their meetings became part of the routine. Daniel would pick her up after work. They'd walk to the park, talk little, laugh at simple things. He treated her with a new kind of care, never in a rush, never expecting more than she wanted to give. "You have a beautiful way of staying silent," he said one day, while they watched a child play in the square. "It's just that I got used to not being heard," she replied. "I hear you," Daniel said without hesitation. And she believed him, not out of naivety, but because, in fact, he did listen. He listened when she talked about little things. He listened when she spoke about the house, about her father, about Scott. And when she didn't want to talk, he just held her hand. Their relationship didn't have an announcement. It just happened. And their wedding was the same way. No big celebration, no excessive guests, no grand promises. Just the two of them, with the certainty of those who have lived too much time, surrounded by absences. They exchanged rings in a quiet registry office, smiled with their eyes, and went back home hand in hand, with the comfortable silence of those who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Over time, the children came, first the boy, then the girl. She chose simple names that fit their smiles. They raised them with what Brenda had learned through pain, presence, equality, love that doesn't choose sides. She was a whole mother, the kind who bends down to look into their eyes, asks before commanding, listens even to the silence of the children. Daniel was a calm father, a firm and sweet man who spoke gently, corrected with kindness, played with interest. He never compared, never divided the affection. It was a home without favorites, without love hierarchies, just respect. Life there was simple, but full of truth. Brenda finally felt she was building something that was hers, a world where no one needed to fade so the other could shine. Her contact with Robert during this time became increasingly sporadic. He didn't call, he didn't ask about the grandchildren. Sometimes he sent a brief message on Brenda's birthday or Christmas. When she sent photos of the kids, he'd respond with a "they're beautiful" or "they've grown." Never a "how are they?" or "can I visit?" Scott was still in Europe, distant and busy. He sent occasional postcards, never came, never called. But in the rare conversations Robert had with someone in the family, he still called him "my pride." It was as if time hadn't taught him anything. Brenda heard those words with the serenity of someone who no longer expected anything. She had accepted that her father was made of choices, and she had never been one of them. But now it didn't hurt the same way. It was an old wound, closed, scarred. It was late afternoon. Brenda was chopping vegetables in the kitchen. The children laughed loudly in the living room, playing a board game on the floor. Then the intercom rang. A short, metallic sound, cutting through the environment like a blade. She wiped her hands on the dish towel and walked to the living room. She walked up to the intercom, pressed the button with her damp fingers, and looked through the camera. She froze for a few seconds. Her body froze. It was Robert, but not the Robert she remembered. Not the proud, confident, rigid man who inhabited her memories. It was someone else. Thinner, almost bent over, with sunburned skin and marked by time. His shoulders slumped, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes deep and without hurry. In his hands he held a plastic bag and a folded envelope. He looked smaller. He looked lost. She pressed the button to speak, but no words came out. She stood there, motionless, looking at the image of that man who had been an absence inside her for so long. "Daughter," he said, his voice weak, almost a whisper. She hesitated for a second, then took a deep breath and pressed the gate button. "Come in," she said, dry, almost automatic. She went to the door, opened it slowly, and stood still, waiting. The children watched her from a distance, quietly, sensing that something was different in the air. Robert walked through the gate slowly. When he reached the entrance, he stopped in front of his daughter and lowered his eyes. as if not knowing where to step. "Are you okay?" Brenda asked in a restrained tone, without any forced softness. He lifted his gaze, and for a moment she recognized in his eyes an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was emotional exhaustion, a silent confession from someone who no longer had the strength to keep up any mask. "Not really," he replied. I wonder if I could come in for a bit." She nodded with a short gesture of her head and opened the door wider. He walked in slowly, holding the bag tightly in his hands, looking around like someone entering a sacred place, not out of respect, but because he didn't feel worthy. Brenda closed the door, walked to the kitchen and pulled out a chair. "Sit down. Do you want a glass of water?" "Yes, please. Thank you." "Iki." She poured the water, placed the glass in front of him, and only then sat down on the other side of the table. "You can talk," she said. "What happened?" Robert ran his hands over his face, then looked at his daughter fixedly. There was something there he had never had the courage to maintain, her gaze, and still he spoke. I didn't want to come here like this. I tried to avoid it. But I'm sick, Brenda. I found out a few weeks ago. The tests. The doctors say it's serious. I don't know how much time I have left." Brenda kept her face impassive, but inside something broke, not out of pity, but because she finally saw the man who had always refused to appear weak, now undone. "I called Scott," he continued. "I told him everything. I asked him to come, stay with me for a while. He said he couldn't, that he's busy, that he has commitments. You know how he is." "I know," she replied, without irony, just with a dry truth. I've been alone. I don't even know what to do anymore. And then I thought maybe you could help me, just for a while, until I figure out what's going to happen." Brenda leaned back in the chair, crossing her arms. She watched the man in front of her without haste. He wasn't the same father who sent her to the garage without hesitation, but he wasn't yet someone she could talk to with an open heart. The past was there, alive, occupying all the spaces between them. "Do you have the tests?" she asked. "They're here," he said, taking the envelope out of the bag and sliding it across the table. "They said I might need treatment, medication, maybe hospitalization at some point. I'm not sure." She didn't grab the envelope. Not yet. She just looked at him, trying to understand what she felt, because it wasn't simple. Nothing was. "Are you hungry?" she asked after a while. "A little. I haven't been eating right for days." "Then eat. After that, we'll figure out what to do." She stood up, grabbed a plate, served it and placed it in front of him. He ate in silence, slowly, but with a certain urgency, as if he didn't know when he'd have another meal like this. Robert finished eating and leaned back in the chair, exhausted. "Can I stay here for a few days? Just until I get organized. I'll sleep on the couch. Anywhere is fine." Brenda breathed deeply. She looked around. The house was small, but it held dignity. And she knew this because she was the one who built it, with every gesture, every brick, every choice. "You can stay," she said at last, "but there's no place here for favorites or poisoned silence. If you're going to stay, it'll be with respect and with truth." Robert nodded slowly, his eyes teary, his face tired. "All right, Thank you, daughter." She didn't respond. She just grabbed the envelope from the table and left the kitchen. In the living room, she sat with the paper in her hands, still sealed. Inside, everything burned, the memories, the pain, the old hurt. But she didn't cry. She never cried. Brenda sat on the sofa for a long time with the envelope of tests in her hands. The house, that house she and Daniel had built with so much effort, seemed smaller with her father's presence, even though he hadn't said much since dinner. She opened the envelope slowly. She read every word of the medical report as if she were reading a sentence written in another language. even though she understood everything. The diagnosis was clear, merciless: prolonged treatment, advanced symptoms, uncertain prognosis. She closed the envelope and left it on the table, her head tilted back, resting on the back of the sofa as she looked at the ceiling, listening to Robert's dragging footsteps in the hallway. She didn't know if she felt pity, anger, sadness, or exhaustion. Maybe all at once, maybe nothing with clarity. The routine settled quickly. As in everything in Brenda's life, she took on the task quietly but precisely. She organized the medication, the schedules, the meals. She took him to appointments, got the tests, helped him bathe on the harder days. It was care that came more from ethics than affection. And still, it was whole. "You need to rest," Daniel said one night when she returned exhausted from the hospital. "I can't," she replied, taking off her shoes. "If I stop, everything falls apart." Daniel didn't insist. He knew her too well to force what she wasn't ready to feel yet. He just hugged her with that firm silence that had accompanied her since their first meeting. Robert, for his part, started observing. At first, in silence, he saw his daughter wake up before everyone, prepare everything, take care of the kids, the house, him. He saw her check twice if the medication was correct, put compresses on his swollen legs when they hurt, make soup when he said nothing went down. He didn't say anything. He just watched. One day, he tried to help set the table. "You can leave it, Dad," she said, taking the plate from his hands. "You don't need to." "But I want to," he replied, almost in a whisper. She didn't insist. She let him place the glasses, even if they were misaligned. It was the first time he offered to help with something so simple. Over time, the silences between them changed in temperature. At first, they were heavy, thick, full of unspoken things. Later, they became long pauses, but less harsh. One afternoon, sitting on the sofa with his feet covered by a blanket, he looked at her for a long time while she washed the dishes. "Were you always like this?" he asked. She stopped for a second, drying her hands on the towel. "Like what?" "Strong, patient, capable." She didn't answer. She went back to scrubbing the cup as if nothing had been said, but her eyes were wetter than the steam from the sink could justify. The following days followed the same rhythm, some better, others more difficult. His physical pain worsened little by little, and with it came bouts of anger, helplessness, frustration. Brenda endured, not passively, but with the firmness of someone who had learned to deal with abandonment. "Sorry, daughter," he said one of those days after a bout of impatience. "Sometimes I don't know how to deal with this." "You don't need to apologize for being sick, Dad. Just don't take it out on those who are helping you." "You're right." The nights were the hardest. He woke up with pain, fear, and confused memories. He called for her, and she came, without complaint. She sat by his bed, held his hand, murmured something calm. "Do you still remember your mother?" he asked one night. "I was very little, but I remember her voice and her hands. She would be proud of you." Brenda took a deep breath, looking at the wall. "You don't need to say that now." "But it's true." She got up, fixed the pillows, and turned off the light. "Good night, Dad. Good night, daughter." And so, day after day, he started seeing for real. The woman who had always been there. The daughter who had never asked for anything but gave everything. He started looking at her with eyes that had once been too occupied with Scott's reflection. And every time she pulled the blanket up to his feet, or put fresh water by his bed, or called the kids for a goodnight kiss, he saw more. It was one of those afternoons when he finally broke the silence. He was sitting on the porch, his knees covered by a blanket. She appeared with yet another cup of tea. "Thank you, Brenda," he said. She simply nodded, preparing to go back to the kitchen. "Wait," he asked. She stopped halfway without turning completely. "Brenda," Robert said with a choked voice, "I need to tell you something. And it's now. Because maybe after..." Maybe after it won't be possible. She slowly turned around, keeping her distance. Her eyes were fixed on him, attentive but without hurry. "I've wronged you," he started with difficulty. "I've wronged you badly, my whole life. And I know it. I know every part of what I did, or what I didn't do." Brenda didn't respond. She just kept looking, waiting for him to continue. "I placed everything on your brother. Everything. All the expectations, all the affection, all my pride. I thought he was my legacy, you know? That if I made him shine, my life would have been worth it." He took a deep breath, his voice starting to falter. "I ignored the obvious. I ignored you. You, right there by my side always. And I, blind with pride, with foolishness. And now, when I needed it most, Scott turned his back." Robert ran his hands over his face, trembling. "I asked for help. I called. I sent messages. I begged. And he said he couldn't. That he was too busy. Commitments, trips, excuses. He left me alone. The son I placed on a pedestal left me alone." His head dropped for a moment, as if the weight of regret was more than his body could bear. "While you, Brenda, you never turned your face. Even after everything, even after the indifference, the times I made you feel less, you stayed. You take care of me, you feed me, you take me to the doctor, you listen to me like I never listened to you." She still didn't move, but her eyes began to shine, discreetly. "I've been unjust, daughter. I've been cruel. I didn't see you. I only saw what I thought I should see. And now I see. You were the sun too. You always were. But I only saw the shadow." He then put his hands to his face and began to cry. A soft cry, contained but dense. It wasn't the cry of someone who wanted to be consoled. It was the cry of someone who, for the first time, understood the harm he had caused. "Forgive me, daughter. If I could go back. If I could do everything again." Brenda took a deep breath, feeling the old pain inside her, but now exposed. She slowly walked to him. She knelt by his chair, as she did with the children when they needed attention, and placed her hand on his. "I know, Dad," she said, with a firm and calm voice. He looked at her with eyes still teary, and she kept her gaze. No tear fell from her face. The forgiveness had already existed. It had been there for a long time. Only now, at last, it had been asked. And now, finally, he deserved it. From that day on, time ran slower. Robert became quieter, but different. His eyes no longer avoided her presence. His gestures were gentle, his gratitude more present. Until one morning he didn't wake up. He passed away in peace in the small room, with the light from the window cutting his tired face. Brenda took care of everything calmly. She prepared his body, called the funeral service, explained it to the kids. Daniel hugged her tightly, and she allowed herself to rest her head on his shoulder. At the funeral, there were no too many flowers, no long speeches. Just her, Daniel, the kids, and a few distant faces. Scott didn't come. He sent a short, cold message that Brenda didn't reply to. She went back home, washed her hands, served the kids dinner, set the tablecloth. And when everyone slept, she sat on the porch where her father used to sit. There, alone, she took a deep breath. She knew, at last, that a cycle had ended. Not as a victim, but as someone who knew how to be whole, even when they were only given halves. And that was all. That was what was enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.